Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar today is on how to use the Azure Pricing Calculator, kind of a little clinic here, and a lot to cover today, so I'll get started. So first of all, just a little bit about who I am. My name is Chris Shalda. I'm our Senior Solutions Architect for Cloud Solutions at CoreTech Services. So basically that means I work a lot with customers on Azure and architecting solutions, pricing solutions, overall just trying to help them meet their business needs. And through that, I do work quite a lot with the Azure Pricing Calculator. I feel like almost every day I'm in the Azure Pricing Calculator. And the thing is, it's a great tool. It can be scary to a lot of people as you start out, but I'm hopefully that through today, you'll be able to have a better comfort level with the Azure Pricing Calculator, as well as just have a better idea of ways that you can utilize it in most effective way. So in general, we'll covering just the fundamental capabilities of the Azure Pricing Calculator, um, and showing you how to actually create some estimates with some of the different kind of more popular, let's just say, Azure services that I see my customers using. I'll also be showing some best practices, really how to get the most out of the Azure Pricing Calculator, as well as some additional tips and other tools that you might be able to use in conjunction with it. And throughout this webinar, probably going to provide some architectural guidance along the way where it is relevant for using the Azure Pricing Calculator effectively. But the intention of this isn't necessarily to provide any sort of comprehensive Azure architectural information. So just be aware of that. And in general, too, we won't be going super deep into the Azure Pricing Calculator and all the resource types there. We might have some additional sessions that we do go through some of the other resources. So please let us know if there's anything that you would like to see that I haven't covered today. But with that, let's just get started. So first I want to let you know kind of when I use Azure Pricing Calculator. So first, as my role as Cloud Solution Architect that I focus in on Azure, I tend to create a lot of price estimates for dozens of customers. This might be just to help them understand the costs when they haven't maybe even tried Azure yet. They're just starting out brand new, or to help our customers to understand the costs for a new Azure solution they're looking to implement, or that we're planning. Or it might just be comparing costs for something that's already in Azure today that we want to look at. All right, well, what if we change this? Then what would that look like in comparison in terms of cost wise? Something that maybe is more optimized. But in any case, when you're utilizing Azure for your business, it's super helpful to be able to quickly estimate different cost scenarios, not just once, but ongoing, because you're always going to be probably changing things, optimizing things, adding things. So it's just a great skill set to really have, is to understand how to use the Azure Pricing Calculator best. So what we're going to do is we're kind of jump right in here to price estimate creation. Through this, I'm going to show you some of the fundamental capabilities here. So let me switch over. So one of the things here that, well, first of all, where we go to, let me just show you. You can just search for Azure Pricing Calculator, right? But best way to Azure to actually go there, because I do this all the time, is aka.ms/Azure Calc. It's just a short link to get you right to the pricing calculator. I've memorized that. I use it all the time. I'd highly recommend that you memorize that too. And when you do get into here, let me show you here. I am logged in, and this is a little message. I'll talk about this real quick. Microsoft is putting this out here. I've been seeing just recently, almost every time I open up the pricing calculator, basically saying that if you have any estimates that are saved, there's a potential that prices do change in Azure. Doesn't happen terribly too often, but when it does, Microsoft just wants you to know that you need to go and reopen the estimates to get the most updated pricing on those. Because if you had something that you had, say, before, and it may not have the most recent pricing, so just be aware of that. So there will be something in the middle of the page here that will ask you to log in here. So let me see if I can actually do this really quickly here for you. So if I go to aka.ms/Azure Calc, I'll show you that it says, hey, you need to enter your information here. Right? So basically any account that is like a Microsoft account, or is your Office 365 account, you can use to log into this. Basically something that's associated with like a Microsoft logon. So when I sign in here, sorry, let me just go grab my password here real quick. So when you sign in here, this is the idea is that you can use the pricing calculator without basically logging in, but there are huge advantages to logging in because you'll be able to save estimates, as we'll see here. We're able to recall estimates. We'll be able to just see everything in one place, and it just all kind of comes back up. And again, you're going to spend some time in here, and I'd hate for you to lose your work. So this is where you definitely want to log in. Make sure that you're logged in here in whatever account that you're going to be using. So what I did to begin with, and I'll just kind of give you an overview here. We see a few tabs up top here. The only ones I typically am using are the products tab, which we'll go through that, saved estimates. You can, feel free to browse around. Always good to understand things, right? Like example scenarios. There are some things that, some like basically built-in architectural scenarios that Microsoft has here that you can kind of play around with, add to an estimate. You can see all the different parts and pieces just to get an idea of like how these things show up in the pricing calculator. I haven't used these because I just have a good idea of how this works now, but good way to start out to understand how that works. Saved estimates, I created one already. You can see that down here, same name here, and it actually shows up in these little tabs here. You can create additional estimates here, but we'll get a little bit into how this works. So to start with, you need to name your estimate. Now, one thing you'll see here is that when you create a new estimate by hitting this little plus button, there's nothing I can click in here. I can't name my estimate. Why not? Okay, well, little idiosyncrasy here, right? You gotta add something, right? So let me just go to the products tab here. There's some of these products that Microsoft's put out here that are the more, what they consider the more popular services, or maybe some services they'd like you to use, like Azure Cognitive Services, right? But basically, you can just click on that. You can search products here. You can check, go through all these different tab areas here to see, different categories of resources. So I'm going to click virtual machines, and I'm in that your estimate here. So what you're going to see here, all of a sudden, this showed up. You can also hit view here. It'll bring you right to it. And now this is editable, right? So this right now, I would say, I like to say, for me, I'm working with a lot of customers, so I like to put in the customer name. In this case, like Katoso. You might say that this is a, I don't know, what do you want to call it? This could be like core IT estimate, right? I like to always put a version on there because I am usually creating multiple versions when there's adjustments, and I don't want to necessarily lose the older versions, or at least want people to know what the latest version is. So at this point here, I'll say V1. And then I like to put in, a lot of times I'm either going to be doing things like pay-as-you-go pricing, or which is basically just paying by the minute of the hour, basically whatever the meter is there, kind of consumption based. And sometimes I like to do, we're doing like reserved instances. So I'd either say like pay-as-you-go to be, that's one type. We're going to get in this a little bit later, or I'll say like I want 1 year reserved instance, just to specifically say what I'm looking at here. But in any case, just make sure that you're naming things in a way that is just kind of makes sense, right? Because you want to be able to recall these things, know what you're talking about or what you're looking at. You might be going back a ways back, months before, maybe even just weeks before, and you're like, oh, where was that estimate? I don't know. What was that called again, right? So make sure that you're naming these really well. And why you're naming these is because, and we'll get into hitting all these little buttons, levers here, right? We're naming these is because what you need to do is save. You need to save this, I would say, fairly often, right? You don't want to make sure, you want to make sure that you save things, you don't lose anything. So when you hit save, it's going to ask you, okay, how do you want to name your estimate? You already kind of named it up front, right? But you could change it here if you wanted to, right? So if we want to say, no, actually this is actually a version 2. This is not a version 1. Let me just hit save here. Great, it's been saved. So where is it? Well, we go to the top again, the saved estimates, and here it is, right? This wasn't here before. So it tells you when it's created, the monthly total that was on there, if there's any upfronts, and then we have some additional buttons here. So we can open up these. So if I close this now, and whenever you close too, it's going to ask you, oh, do you want to delete your estimate? Or you're going to delete the estimate basically. And they're asking if you want to save beforehand. So if you had just saved, I can say, no, I don't need to save it because I just saved it. But in general, I'd like to say yes, unless maybe I changed something and I didn't want to keep those changes. Okay, maybe I'll say no. But in most cases, I'll say, yeah, go ahead and save it. Always good to just be like, yeah, I can't remember if I saved it. Let's save it. All right, cool. So now it says it's saved, right? So same idea as hitting save, but when you close it here. And so, all right, I want to open this guy back up. I hit open. And it's going to load my estimate up. So as you see down here, it already populated behind the scenes here, right here. So it's another tab. I'm good to go. So it just pulled it right up for me. So that's basically saving. Now, if we want to go and we want to save it as something else. So if we're saying, all right, well, save as is to make a copy of something. So I already saved this guy, great, but I want to save this as a copy as something else. So I'm in here. I want to make a v3, right? Let's do a v3 here. Now, the interesting thing is it's not exactly like you'd use in you'd be in Office where it's keeps the save as one open. It actually just creates it in the background, and then you got to go and you have to open up that one separately. So there you go. Now I have both of these guys open. Now there is a limit in terms of how many estimates are open. The tool will let you know when you have too many open. Can't say that I haven't had that happen to me like a lot. That it's like, oh, you have too many estimates open. Oh my gosh, okay, fine. I only got to close these things out or whatever else. But just be aware that's a thing. Is that, and you can't really reorder these here. You can't drag and drop them anything. So you will have to close them out if you have too many of them. So there's that piece there. So now we showed opening, closing, we showed saving as. Another thing you can do here is if you want to, instead of doing the save as, you can just say, all right, I just want to copy this guy. Boom, copied it. So it just adds a little copy in parentheses afterwards. So if you're like, oh, I don't want that name to be that name, but let's open it up here. Let's say this one I was going to do reserved instances on it. Yes, that pop-up message is coming up quite a bit. They don't want you to forget that. All right, so if I go here and I can say I want this to be 1 year reserved instance here, great. But what do we got to do? We got to save it. All right, so we'll say save. It's good to save it as soon as you change the name, right? Just to make sure that you got that clearly set up there. Make your changes, add things, move things, whatever, and then hit save again, right? So that's going to be, you see here, it already changed for us. So that's kind of how you would duplicate estimates. There's good reasons to do that. We'll get into that a little bit later. Another thing is you can share estimates. So something that you'll see down here as we're just gonna go right to the bottom here. We have export, save as, share. So we looked at save and save as. Share is interesting. So share is really just going to create a shared link for you. Okay. So what you can do is you can share this with anybody. They don't even have to be logged into the Azure Pricing Calculator or anything like that. And it's going to take what is a snapshot of the estimate here. Now I say that very specific, a snapshot, because this is now anybody that uses that link, if you change this original estimate, it will not change for that shared link. It is a snapshot. However, if somebody wants to take that and they want to modify it, it's not like it's some read-only snapshot necessarily for them, but they can go. So I'm going to grab one from a different account that I have here. So what I'm just going to do is take the shared link that somebody shared with me. It was myself, I know. Put it in here, right? And since I'm still logged in here as the AZ demo account here, right? Still logged in. What you're going to see is all of a sudden this estimate is going to show up right in line with all my other estimates. Right? So everything was just brought back into here, right? Wow. Okay. So Fabricam. So this one here, right? I'm just making things up here, but that one showed up here. Now, if I wanted to keep that, so that's not showing up in my saved estimates because it's not saved, right? It's just, I just opened an estimate. Great. Well, I want to do something with this. I want to actually, I actually don't want one. I want 9 VMs here, right? And I want to change the size to this size or whatever, right? Great, right? Then what I'm going to do here is I want to keep this now. I'm going to save this. Maybe this is a 1.1, right? Because I changed it, sure. And now we'll see on the top, there it is, right? But I could still, anybody else can still open up this estimate, even though I saved it, even though, even if it's somebody, the original one got changed. Again, this is a snapshot in time that does not change from every time that you open up that that estimate, that shared link. So it'll all be the same each time. So the good news is kind of keeps the fidelity there, right? The thing you have to keep in mind is if you do update an estimate and you want to share it, you want the person to have a new one, you got to share the new link to the new one. It'll create a new unique link for you. But as you see, it's back to V1 here, kind of only has the 1 VM here, right? So this is, again, this is the snapshot. But this can be very useful because instead of what I'm going to show you next is creating an export of this, which it's good, right? Because it puts it in Excel, but at the same time, maybe that's not exactly what you want. Somebody maybe wants to modify it, right? And change some things around really easily. Well, if you export it, there's no way to import here. So that's maybe one of the only downsides, or I mean, sure there's other downsides, but one of the major downsides here is that you can't actually import information into the Azure Price Calculator from like an Excel spreadsheet or something else like that. But what I'll show you is exporting it. All right, so this is that Fabricam one that I, up to 9 instances here. Basically, all I do is, it's going to be export estimate. Now, one of the things I always do in here is I do change the name of the file because you'll just have export estimate, like I have 6 and then 7 and 8, 9, 10. Make sure you take, what I like to do is just take the exact naming I have here and copy it. Like just copy this, and you're going to put it right into right into the file name. Sometimes I don't open the file directly. I'll just it'll go to my downloads. I just change the name of the file right there. I'll move it into a folder, like one of my customers folders, so that I have it where I want it to be. And then, I have the estimate. So in this case, I just open it directly, and it looks a lot like that other estimate, right? Because it is basically, but it's in Excel form. So decent way to kind of save some things off and to not have to use it right inside the Azure pricing calculator. So if you weren't kind of creating a quote or some sort of estimate otherwise, it'll give you all the details and exactly kind of what you set here, any of the custom names that you set, and then your estimated costs. And this is a little bit off here. This should be over here for some reason, but give you the totals. And then this is just kind of, again, another snapshot in time here. So that's one way you can share this information out as well too, if you don't want somebody going to the pricing calculator directly, or if you need to store this for some reason, like for us, like before we start a project, if I'm architecting something, I'm going to export something out so that I have kind of like a record, if you will, of what we architected and what the costs were expected to be, and I'll store that along with the other project artifacts, for example. So that's kind of what an exported estimate looks like. All right, so that's kind of the fundamentals, I'd say here. Other things just to keep note of on the bottom here, and we'll get into the meat here in a second. There's support plans, right? So if you wanted to, right, you can say, is support included, meaning it's going to be $0? Is it developer support, standard, professional, direct? These are just the kind of add-on like monthly support options. I usually don't use these because there's usually some other support plan that's in place, either one that, like if the customer is working through us, it's through our CSP program, or through an EA, or they have unified support. So in terms of cost wise, I usually don't even mess with the support. I just leave it as included. As far as licensing program, the MCA is essentially kind of basically their retail, let's say, rates at that point. You can do enterprise agreement. It's going to ask you to kind of like log in and sign up because you may have some specific agreements. This is going to be tied into your Azure AD login here. if you're tied to that EA, because there may be some specific pricing kind of concessions, those types of things that can be built into this. But for the most part, I just do Microsoft Customer Agreement because it's kind of retail pricing and it works kind of across the board there. Yeah, so that, I mean, that's kind of the high level here. So what we're going to do now is get into the meat and potatoes. So the actual resources of what you're going to be estimating, right? Now, some things that you're going to need to know before you start building out all these crazy estimates, right? A few things. So first of all, and I'll just kind of use this as an example here. Right now, this is just a virtual machine. So you'll see here, virtual machine is the type here. It gives you a little bit of a kind of a high level of what is in here, what you selected up top here, and you can collapse this if you want to, just to give yourself a little bit more room. And you'll see some things that are going to be, all these fields are going to be slightly different depending on the resource type. So first thing you're going to see is region. So that's one thing you're going to have to find out before you start at all, is which region are we putting these things into? If it's already existing Azure solution, or you already have region set up, probably, right, you're going to use the same region. So just make sure you select the right region. If you're starting out brand new, you need to think about which region you wanted to use, because you want the prices to be consistent for the region that you're targeting, because there are some differences between different regions. And I have a tool I can show you a little bit later in terms of looking at, for example, VM prices across regions and where they might be different. So make sure you know that first. And for some reason, and I'll show you this I'll show you here just to give you an example here. For some reason, some of these resources, when you select them, they will default to certain regions like West US. Okay, great. When I did the, I added the virtual machines, but let's add an Azure SQL database. I think this one's a little different. This does East US, right? So there's not much consistency there, but that just means you've got to look and make sure your region is set properly, because the pricing could be different, and you want to make sure. End of the day, trying to make these as accurate as possible, right? It may not be 100% accurate, but try to be, right? Try to be where you can. Spend the time to do that. I've been told that my estimates are scary accurate. It's because I pay attention. I look at the details. I make sure that I'm getting some of these questions answered up front, so we can be very close to what reality is going to be once these things get deployed, right? So that's a region is one thing. All right, you're going to have to know things like, what your payment model is going to be. So here you'll see with the compute, you have pay as you go, 1 year reserved, 3 year reserved. So this is just on the compute itself. This doesn't count the storage, or you see here like Windows, any OS or other types of licensing here. It's just the compute. So pay as you go, you're going to be paying basically while it's turned on and not deallocated, from a VM perspective here. And you'll see, okay, great, that's $137.24 for this specific instance size and one of these. But as you can see here, they give you a little cheat sheet, right? 41% discount, 62% discount. If you do 1 year reserved, it's quite a bit less, right? And then you go 3 year reserved, wow, even more, even less than that. And you can decide whether you want to show it monthly or if you're going to be paying upfront. You have two options when you pay for reserved instances. Most of my customers pay monthly because, unless you have some major reason you need to from an accounting perspective to pay upfront, monthly, just from a cash flow perspective, seems to make more sense. So just be aware of that when you're going in here. In this case, I said this entire one's pay as you go. I'm going to show you what I do to do a comparison after we kind of go through this of like what would a 1 year reserve, 3 year reserve be, but for everything that I have listed, not just this VM. So other things you'll see here, like Windows, or the operating system. So is this a Windows VM? Is this a Linux VM? If you choose, if it's on Windows here, you'll see this is here. I love this. This was not here all the time. This is a fairly recent, it might be a year or more now, but gosh, huge thing where this OS cost was kind of like built in and you couldn't really tell, well, how much of the license itself cost me here, right? Now this license is going to be dependent typically on how many CPUs. It's not always linear, but generally, right, the more CPUs, the more the Windows license is going to cost. Now, if you have things like Azure Hybrid benefits through software subscriptions that you might have, maybe through a CSP, like Cortex or something like that, or you have software assurance benefits, then you can take advantage of Azure Hybrid benefit, and then basically you already paid for that license, right? You don't have to pay for it again. So that will reduce the cost to only the compute cost here. So again, good thing to know kind of upfront. Do you have Azure Hybrid benefits or enough Azure Hybrid benefits to cover this VM or other VMs, everything that you're using in Azure or not? That's where some might be license included with pay-as-you-go licensing, or some might be Azure Hybrid benefit. Just select the right one there. And you'll see that when you go to Linux, and as you note here, right, the $70.08, you go to Linux, all of a sudden, oh, where'd it go? No, it's nowhere to be found now for the OS, because when you're talking about Ubuntu here and some of the other ones that are zero cost, like open source, there is no cost for that Linux, so it doesn't include any sort of OS cost. Doesn't give you an option. Now, if you do choose things like Red Hat Enterprise, right? There are costs on that because there's some additional, kind of like support costs, maintenance costs, those types of things that you get with Red Hat Enterprise. Now, you probably wouldn't willy-nilly just choose that. That would probably be a decision by your organization whether you'd want something with, that additional support contract. But even that, there are hybrid benefits if you purchase that kind of in a different way, kind of upfront, if you will. So just be aware of that. CentOS is, there's no cost for that either, right? So let's keep it on Windows. Standard versus basic tier. I don't think I've ever used basic tier. I mean, that'd be for really, like, you really don't care if those VMs are running or not. You'll see other things like that's similar to that, like spot instances and things that's like Microsoft could take those away from you whenever that they wanted to, because there's other contention for those sizes. That's great for if you're doing HPC or these batches or machine learning, these clusters, that type of stuff, where it's okay, you're doing all these parallel workloads. If you lose some instances, they can be made up for. It's no problem, right? But in most cases, standard is going to be probably what you choose here. Now you get into some of these things here, and you're like, all right, great, I understand the regions, the operating system. Oh, here too, this is interesting. So BizTalk or SQL Server, if you want those, if you're not going to be paying for those kind of out of band, let's just say, even if you are paying from out of band with Azure Hybrid benefit, SQL Server comes up a lot, and you'll see here it adds another piece here. I would still select it here, even if you are paying for it with software assurance or software subscriptions, because you can still say Azure Hybrid benefit. But the beauty is that it kind of tracks this in the naming when you export these things, so oh yeah, this is supposed to be a SQL Server, right? So even if you are using Azure Hybrid benefit, I still would put the type SQL Server here for SQL. And you'll see another thing came up here, license type, right? So there's 3 license types of SQL that will work on Azure. We got Web, Standard, and Enterprise. I hardly ever see SQL Web being used. It's usually Standard and Enterprise. There's quite a bit of difference between Standard and Enterprise. Now these, it's like minimum 4 cores that it's looking at for the VM. So a 2-core and a 4-core is basically going to be the same cost for SQL. But Standard here, you see it's $292, whereas Enterprise is quite a bit more, right? So we're looking at almost 3 times, over 3 times as much here. So you want to be intentional about what you would be, at the very least, estimating, but also what you're actually going to be deploying. There's reasons to do one versus the other. I'm not going to get into that today. I've had other webinars on our Tech Tuesdays that refer to that, so I'd say check those out. But in general, choose the one that you would want there, and you can have it pay as you go or hybrid benefit. All right. So we'll just turn that off for now. Say OS only, and we'll get into, okay, what size do we need to have here, right? So this is where this starts tripping people up. Now, if you're starting from scratch and you're like, you just want to look at a few VMs, you want to get an idea here, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on how to get an idea of what size and instance type and then version and all these crazy letters you're going to see in the that get tacked onto these names, to give you an idea of what to choose and what you're looking at there. But if you're going to be doing something like a much larger scale type of, you're trying to do an estimate of your data center, and you want to say, all right, I want to move my entire data center over to Azure, and we're talking, we got more than like 5 or 10 machines, right? I would highly recommend you start using some other tools for those. Things like there's Azure Migrate, and there's other tools out there, Movair, and just plenty of other third-party tools as well that will do a full assessment of your environment. If you have VMware, you can even take information out of VMware, or they'll deploy some agents to look at actual resource usage, that type of thing. In fact, most of our customers I would say check with us, right? But most of our customers would qualify for an assessment by Microsoft at no cost. So we come in, Microsoft would pay for us to come in to perform the assessment using some of the top tools, and we know what we're looking at and how to interpret the information, so we can give you a better idea of what that is actually going to cost. And we're pretty dang close with those from what I've seen once we do those assessments and what reality is, and we'll give you an idea of like all these other parts and pieces you may not be aware about of like backups and DR and storage and all these other pieces, so that you can have a better picture and TCO about what you're looking at. So let us know if you want us to do something like that, like an actual data center assessment. I'll have some contact information at the end here for you. But that's something definitely, on a larger scale, use some other tools. On a smaller scale, you can kind of type some stuff in here. We can kind of manually set some things, or if you just kind of want to play around, see what's available here. So what you'll see here is categories. These are different categories Microsoft has defined in terms of the types of kind of, it's the mix of CPU and RAM and GPU in some cases, right? And storage in some cases, depending on what you're trying to do, right? Like I would say if you're going to be doing something with SQL, I would say you want to do memory optimized in most cases, right? You're doing things that are very highly, compute intensive, they don't need as much memory, compute optimized. Otherwise, general purpose. It's kind of like in the middle there, right? So there's these kind of just already kind of filter things down for you, because if you look at the instances here, you're like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of stuff here, right here, and there's a lot to scroll through. So you may want to filter it down. Now, for me, I know what categories are what and what instance series are what, because here's all the instance series here. So we have like a D2 SV5, right? So this is actually under the DSV5 series, right? This is actually, if I click on this, I'm only going to see anything that's in the DSV5. So that one doesn't go away. I only see what's in here. And we can see, give you a little bit of information around how much CPU, RAM, whether it has temporary storage, that type of thing, and the different series names. Now, if I change this over to something else, let's go to an ESV5. All of a sudden it changes this because that D2 SV5 is no longer in this series. So it gives me all of these, right? One thing to note, you will see things with like some of these, I'm going to say all of them, but some of the instance series, they do have a dash after the first number. And you're like, okay, well, that's kind of weird. Why, like, there's 3 E32s when there's like a -16-8. Well, if you see, look closely here, E32, and they're starting to do this with the newer series, which is really nice, is that usually with the newer series, the first number refers to the number of CPUs, vCPUs. Now this one only has 16. Well, the -16 means that it's not -16, it's actually saying it is 16. It's constraining the number of cores to 16. Like this one is constraining the number of cores to 8. So you see 8 here. This is important when you need a lot more memory, but you don't need all the CPUs because you're paying per CPU for licensing, especially for SQL. We see that a lot. You can save a lot of money by not having to pay for the extra SQL licenses, because it just basically masks the CPUs on that VM. You still pay the same cost, as you'll see here. The cost is the same for all three of these per hour. So the same cost here, but you'll be able to save on the licensing cost. If you only need like 16 cores of, for compute, but you need to have all this memory, the 256 gig memory, as opposed to going to maybe 16 here. I have 120. I need 256 memory. All right. Well, we'd have to go here, but now I have to pay for, another 16 cores of SQL licensing. Oh no. Well, not if you choose this guy here, right? So that just gives you an idea, because you will see that in some places. There are specific times that you would want to use that. So that just gives you an idea there. Okay. And I'm going to show you kind of where to get a little bit more information about all this stuff too. Other things to be aware of. It's like acronym soup here, right? You have things like EA, DS, V5, right? It's like, oh my gosh, what am I looking at here? So let's break it down. The common things, right? So first, if we have I think we just have an E series. We should have just an E something, yeah. Where they put this, like EV5, right? So that's your base E series version 5. Each version, and I'm going to show you where you can get more information about this. Each version typically has more I mean, more recent compute, right? So you might have the same number of processors, but each of the processors in that same, in the new series is going to have additional maybe clock speed or other capabilities, right? That's going to be in almost every case better than the previous series, right? So that's something I typically like to stay with the later series if possible. The later series, you will find they're not always available in every region, so you do have to check on that as they're rolling them out. They may not be everywhere, but I'd still check on that where you can and try to keep consistency on the series where you can, right? At least for versions. It helps with when you're purchasing reserved instances and the like, that type of thing. So this is the base one. The next one I want to show you is the ESV5. So, okay, now we have an S. Well, let's look at EV5. So EV5 here, great. This all looks kind of the same here. But when we go down to manage disks, this is key here. You're only going to see two options. You're going to see a hard disk drive and a standard SSD. All right. That's because you're not going to see what's called a premium SSD unless you have an S. I don't know if S means super or speedy, whatever you want to think about it, right? Or special, I don't know. But if you do want to have premium SSDs, which I would recommend for pretty much anything production, I always say like use premium SSDs. There's also ultra SSDs and there's some other things, right? But that typically don't go with standard SSDs or just regular hard disk drives for production unless there's a good reason to do that. So if we go to ESV5, great. Now we have premium SSD. Right? In most cases, I'd say just go with the S, especially for production, because you can always switch. If you started with standard SSD, you can go to premium SSD, right? As opposed to rebuilding the VM. So that's something to consider there. Other thing too, you're going to see. So we have like an EDS, right? So an EDS V5 series, all right? So what does that mean? Well, when we were on, let me go back to ESV5. ESV5 here, you're going to notice here 0 gigabytes of temporary storage. Right? Now, temporary storage is just that. It's truly temporary. When the VM reboots, it's gone. So not a lot of good things to put in there that you want if you want to keep them around. But one thing that's really good to put in there is like a temp disk. So or scratch disk, right? So scratch disk for Linux that's anyways gets blown away after you reboot, or for SQL, a temp DB, right? Because this temporary storage is actually local to the VM. This is actually on the hardware right next to where that's running, as opposed to, I mean, we add other disks like the premium SSDs, standard SSDs, whatever. That's on remote storage. So not necessarily a bad thing, but the temporary storage is very fast because it's local, and that's a great thing to take advantage of when you're talking about SQL. So be aware of that it's 0 temporary storage, which does save you a little money. You'll see here, I'm going to look at this, right? So 159.14. If I go to go over here to the D series, EDS V5. I know it's a little bit of eye chart here, right? But just pay attention to the letters, EDS V5. Oh, look, that has 75 gigabytes of storage. And that did go up, right? So it's around 150 something, went up to 172. So they are including a little bit extra cost for that. But if you don't need it, well, then get the one without temporary storage. Save some money, right? So you do have options here. Now we start getting into some other things like EAS V5. So an A, so the D, so again, S means so speedy SSDs, right? So premium disks, premium SSDs. D means dedicated disks, dedicated temporary disks. And then there's an A. So, okay, what are we talking about here with the A now, right? All right, so let's go into A here. All A means is that this is running an AMD chip, as opposed to if it doesn't have an A, it's running an Intel chip. So you have an option there. They're just not the same VMs. They are a little bit different costs. They have a little bit, processors, as you may know, Intel and AMD does do things a little bit differently. So it's kind of a preference there. But that's where you want to just be aware of that and be intentional about whether you select them with an A or you don't select them with an A, for example. And there's some additional ones in here I'm not going to get too much into. There's other C's and things like that. But those are the main ones. The S's, the D's, and the A's are the ones you really want to be worried about. Now, you're like, okay, great. Well, I'm seeing all these series. I don't know what I'm looking at. All I can tell is how many CPUs and RAM. Is that all that matters? Well, no, not really. What you want to look at here is VM sizes. The VM size documentation. So I just typed in Google, Bing, whatever, to say Azure VM sizes. I don't know if there's a short link for this, but it always brings me to this page. I'm like, great. It brings me right here, and it's the sizes for Azure virtual machines in Azure. There's, oh, that's it. That might be new. I don't know if I'm going to click on this right now, but virtual machine selector tool. So that might be something to look at. But what you'll see here is, here's those same types, right? General purpose, compute optimized, memory optimized, storage optimized, GPU, HPC. It'll tell you the different sizes, the series that are in each of these here. It'll give you a description of what they are. I kind of gave you a high level overview of that, right? Like high CPU to memory ratio for compute optimized, high memory CPU for memory optimized, right? High disk throughput for storage optimized, those types of things. And you can click into these. They used to let you click here, but let's say click on general purpose here. Great. Now you get even more information about these, like the different series here. Now, what are the different series and what are they capable of doing? You'll see a P over here now, right? There's a whole nother one. Like that's for ARM64 based VMs, right? That's probably gonna be very specialized, right? So just be aware of that. But you can see these here, and if you want to get in even deeper here, which one we're looking at, right? So the V5s. There's DV5 and DSV5s. So we'll start here, DV5. As you know, right? So does it have a premium storage? No, premium storage is not supported here, right? But for the most part, everything else is the same between that and the DSV5. So you'll see here, premium storage is supported. And you'll see other things like whether live migration supported, memory preserving updates, what generation VM support it takes, accelerated networking, this is actually required. Whether if you want to use ephemeral OS disks, oh, I can't use it on this, I gotta go find something else. If you want to use nested virtualization, oh, cool, that works on this. But the really key thing to look at is some of this information here. You're going to see this one doesn't have that extra D in it, right? So there's no temporary storage disk. That's why it says remote storage only here. But you'll see you see a CPU and memory. If you want to know more about the CPU, it'll tell you the generation here, the clock speeds. So you'll get an idea there. And then what's really important is the number of data disks. So if you need to have a lot of data disks, you need to consider that. Some of these you may need to go to a larger size. If you need, oh, I need to have 10 data disks. Well, you're gonna have to start with the D8, SV5 for that. If you have a certain amount of this throughput that you need to have, you can look at that here from IOPS and megabytes per second. That's the max that I can have. You have to have the amount of disks that will support that, to add up to that, but it will not go above that for that VM size. Number of NICs, the max bandwidth here. So that's where, you may want to go and you look into other things like, oh, geez, I just need to have some more memory per CPU, or I need to have more throughput here, right? That's where we might go into the SV5 series. And we can see, data disks are basically the same and throughputs and stuff like that, but more memory, great. There's a new one, EB. So there's another one here. B, I forget what they actually mean by that one, but it's got much higher IOPS and throughput for remote disk storage. So if you need a lot, this is like a brand new one here. So this has just come out. They may not be available everywhere, but this one has a lot more, basically just speed to the disks. So if you need a lot more storage optimization and need the memory, right, that's one to look at. So just want to give you an idea. That's where to find that information, because that's really important when you're doing VMs. VMs, I want to say, is the simplest yet the most complicated, because there's so many things to be selecting there to do it properly, but things to consider there. Bandwidth is here, so if you're going to be doing, if right, you can at least kind of estimate what type of egress basically you're going to be having here. So if you're going to say out to the internet, this VM is going to have, I don't know, it's going to be 50 gigabytes or whatever else. Let's say 500 to get something to show up here, right? 500 gigabytes per month, right? These are all monthly prices. You can include that in here. You can include that separately in a separate line item. I do that sometimes, that combined, making just some sort of estimates. A lot of times you don't know until you start deploying things, though. That's the only thing. So that's really virtual machines. I know there's a lot of information on that, but that's kind of how I go through deciding like what I'm going to do for those. So going next, I want to show you Azure SQL Database. So this is going to be Azure SQL Database, single database, or elastic database. You'll see here is a type, right? Make sure you select the right region that you want to have here. So you'll kind of pretty much have to know whether you want to go single or elastic, right? But that's how you select it here. You want to determine where do I want my backups to be stored. Do I want it to be only stored locally or just zonally within the same data center, just in or same region, just different data center in the same region. Yeah, that's not bad. Maybe you do those for development and testing. If you're going to do anything production, I'd probably almost always say use the GRS, which is globally redundant. This is read access, so you can read from it anytime in the other region, the paired region. So make sure you select the backup tier properly. And you'll see these little tooltips here too. Really cool. It gives you, links directly. Oh, what is this thing, right? Okay, I can click on this. It'll give me some more information. So it's always something good to look at. Another tooltip here, usually on all these, each resource type, you can go to pricing details, which I'll show you that. Product details, documentation. So it gives you some real quick information on that there. So if you want to understand kind of how the pricing is, for this in particular, Azure SQL database pricing, how it's happening under the covers, right? Because it looks a little like a voodoo otherwise. You can select kind of on the top here what you want, what vCore model, DTU, the region, right? We were in East US, so make sure you select these things. You can actually see the full monthly pricing as opposed to hourly. Different service tiers, we'll get into that in a second. But you'll go down here and say, okay, this is a locally redundant database. I can see in a standard series how many minimum cores, maximum cores in the memory. This does scale up kind of linearly as far as memory and cores. Show you how much per month the storage is, because this is not apparent in the calculator itself a lot of times. It's just like you put in numbers and it gives you some calculation of, well, how did you get to that calculation? This is how you get to it, right? So if you want to kind of break this stuff down into how much it's costing or why you'd choose one or the other based off cost, this is a good idea to look at, right? So this is really provisioned compute is what we're looking at here. So locally redundant database, standard series Gen 5. It gives you the number of cores in memory because these are kind of tightly coupled here, that you can't really have more memory without having more cores. Pay as you go, 1 year reserved, 3 year reserved, right? So it gives you kind of a table of all these things, all the different ancillary costs. This is business critical as opposed to general purpose, right? So it's going to give you an idea. That's always somewhere you can look at to be like, how are these numbers all coming out? Like there's some voodoo magic going behind the scenes here. That's one way to look at it. This is the provision versus serverless you saw on that pricing calculator, right? You pretty much have to know what you want to do here. Most cases provisioned. Serverless is another option. I do that only intentionally if we needed that. General purpose and business critical are typical. Hyperscale is a very specific use case. So select the ones you want. Business critical is quite a bit more because it's actually using always on availability groups in the background. You select the hardware type if you have an option here. Business critical does not. Or sorry, business critical does, I think. Oh, it still does, yep. So you can choose that. Again, that's going to be in that pricing details. How big the instance is going to be here, right? What type of redundancy do you want? So local redundant within one data center within the region, or zone within multiple data centers within the region. Then those are availability zones, by the way. How many databases you're going to have here. This is on a single database, right? So how many you want. Again, page go, 1 year, 3 year. SQL license you're paying as you go. Do you have an Azure Hybrid benefit? You can switch that up depending on that. How much data are you going to be storing in there? How big is it going to be? They automatically break out log storage for you. They just do kind of like a general 30% because you're going to need log storage. So they kind of do that for you there. Point in time restore. So you get up to the same amount of data that you purchase here in point in time restore in terms of the snapshots and restoring those. If you want to have more than that, or you're expecting to need to have more point in time restores than just 1 times the amount of the database, then you would add in, probably not 50 here if I'm 32 gig database, but another 5, let's just say 20 gigs or whatever else, right? At least gives you some numbers here in terms of cost if you need more there. Long-term retention. So this is beyond just point in time restores, which they think about that like being less than 30 days typically. You need more than 30 days. You got to say, okay, how big is the backup of this database going to be, right? Like how big is the database itself going to be? In this case, all right, so we're let's say maybe it's 40 gigabytes, and then how many weekly, monthly, yearly backups that you'd want. So let's say we've got 4, 12, and 1. Now you might be like, depending on the size here, right? If it's much larger size database, it'd be much larger numbers here. you're going to be like, whoa, that's a lot of money for that. Well, it's the cost that comes out here. Like, let's just say we go up to like a terabyte, right? And we're going to say it's at least a terabyte for average backup, right? So it's storing because there's 17 total backups that it would be keeping. That's why the number looks a little big. But this number is not $870 per month starting in the first month in this case, because in the first month it's only going to have 4 of these 17. Now, when you get to that first year, then the monthly will be this much. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that these backup costs are like once you have all of the replicas, then it'll cost this much. So it's going to ramp as you get closer to that. So something to keep in mind. App Service. So this guy here, again, choose a region. We want Windows or Linux, right? So that'll change the cost because they just build in the Windows costs. Your tier, you're going to want to look at things like go here and see the pricing details or product details to understand the tiers. Oh, look at that. Do it right for you. Didn't realize I had that here. So have different tiers here, depending on what you're going to do. For production, probably never do basic, standard, or premium. One thing to note, though, here's a little Easter egg. As you notice here, there's no option for pay-as-you-go, reserved instance, anything like that, even with Premium V2. But what came out with Premium V3, which is why I tend to look at this for a lot more for production workloads, all of a sudden you have options for reserved instances, right? So that's where you can save some money on the compute. Be aware, though, if you're doing auto scaling, you have to think through this of like, all right, I want to have a minimum of 2 instances, but I want it to scale up to 5, right? Well, you may want to only do 2 instances here with, let's say, a 1-year reserved, and then maybe go up to this plus button here. You can clone this and say everything else being the same. I want to have 3 instances maybe that are pay as you go, but on average, they're not going to be running 730 hours a month. They might only be running 250 hours a month, something like that, right? So you can kind of mix these together. Just make sure you label things properly so you know what you were doing here, right? But that's just a little tip there in terms of app service, especially if you're doing auto scaling, right? Actually, let me show you couple other things here. So I'm going to show you some things around storage. So as we saw with the VMs, right, we can add a disk, right? So like, okay, there's your OS disk, right? 128 gigs, great, but I need more disks. I wouldn't typically add them here. I would actually just add a line item, a storage account line item, choose the type manage disks. There's never really any reason anymore to go with page blobs on managed disks. Go with managed disks in almost every instance. And then say, all right, I want some more premium SSDs. You'll notice here that they are not geo-redundant. You can only do locally redundant or zone redundant, and that's going to be dependent on your kind of VM cluster. Let's just say if it's locally redundant or zone redundant. And then select your sizes, right? So I want some of these. I need 2 more 100, terabyte disks here. Now you'll see you can do when you're reserved. It's not much off. Like that was like $14 off. It's typically like 5% maybe. I usually don't bother with reserved disks. It just tends to be a little bit more of a hassle than dealing with that as opposed to other, compute-wise, you can get 40, 60% off, right, for reserving. That highly consider that. But disks, I don't know. Take it or leave it on that one. I usually don't. You'll see other things like when you add, if you want to take snapshots of disks, right, that you can say how big the snapshots are going to be. You got to do some calculations there. Disk bursting, so you can allow them to go up to higher amounts here. So you can say when you're expecting that to happen and how much you want it to burst. And then there's shared disk. This is a fairly new option here where you can have a disk share between VMs. So in some cases, this is like do a cluster, like a SQL cluster. You can have shared disks like an FCI cluster. And that's how you say, okay, I need 2 mounts here because I'm going to have 2 VMs talk into this, or 3. It depends on the application you're using, whether you can do this or not. SQL is one option, right? If you do it FCI, for example. Backups. Just want to show you this real quickly. Azure VMs, or SQL Server on Azure VMs, right? So start with Azure VMs. How many VMs? How much on average per VM. So you got to kind of add up all the data, divide by the number of VMs, put that in here, right? So if you had more than one VM, you got to do that. Set your backup policy. You can have instant snapshots for a certain amount of time, calculates all this for you. You can determine how much data churn you're going to have. This tells you here about how much data churn you're expecting. So like something that's like a much higher, use your database server or something like that, be high churn. So that sets everything where you want. Do you want it to be redundant? Do you want to be able to read the backups from a redundant anytime? That's what you do. It'll calculate how much average backup data and snapshot usage, and then this will be your monthly cost once you hit all of these retention periods, right? So it's going to be less than that before that. It's going to ramp up, like I said, the other one. This is a really good link. This will take you to a page that get you Excel spreadsheet that does a lot more detailed look at the backups to see how that's going to cost and over time. I recommend doing that if you want to get more detail there. Let's see, the other thing here, manage instances similar. So other things around storage accounts, so like blob storage, for example, when you're in the standard tier, you can do reservations here, basically, but be aware. So if I say, okay, I want a terabyte here, great. Now I've got a 1 year reserved. What? 100 terabytes, right? You can always take the petabyte down to 0, right? But it's minimum 100 terabytes. So if you're less than probably, I think it's, I forget what the percentage was, but let's say less than 70, or I guess it'd be, 70 terabytes, probably don't want to do reserved capacity for 100 terabytes, but you might want to eventually once you get there. So I'd stay with pay as you go here. 38%. So let's say like 60%, 60 terabytes, right? This be kind of your break even. So that's what you got to look at and plan for. There's different access tiers you would choose here where you want your redundancy similar to the other things. And then the type of storage, I would probably always go with general purpose V2 going forward. It's got the most capabilities. You'll have to look into things like write operations, list, create, read. You may have to make some kind of high level, estimates here because it's going to be hard to tell without knowing the patterns of your application. But that's where some of this is a lot more art than science initially. But you just have to keep going back and checking and validating off these things. So that's all I want to show you there. Now, one thing is, if you want to say, all right, I want to compare with pay-as-you-go to like 1 year reserved, I think we do that. I don't want to put all this stuff back in again. I'm not doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the top, and this one is the Contoso Estimate 1, pay-as-you-go. And I'm going to say, I want to copy that. Cool. All right, copy that one. I'm opening that one. Oops. Sorry, go back to this one here. And then we are going to, so we open that one. Now we're going to change the name here. So I want, let's do 3 year reserve. Let's go crazy, right? So I'm going to change that. Now I'm going to go through here. All I got to do, I'm going to hit 3 year reserved. Or 1 year reserved if that's an option, right? In this case, those are the disks. We don't care about that. Backups don't have it. Database does. So we're going to do that. This one has it here. We don't want to do 3 reserved here because it's going to be 100 terabytes. Look, hey, the V3 premium V3s that has it too. All right. So I hit that. Hit save. Save that guy. All right, and I keep the same version number because it's really the same exact thing here, but they're here, right? And I can compare. Oh yeah, look, I can just see the pricing right here. This is 4,100 almost, and 3,000. I save like $1,100. Awesome. And then I might, send those both to my customers. Export both of them, send them off, send shared links, that type of thing. So that just gives you an idea of some of those things to do there. All right, so we're gonna wrap up here as we're kind of coming up on the hour. Basically here, I'm going to show you some third-party resources. So unfortunately, 2 of these things I have used in the past and kind of recently, and they're not actually working anymore. But the first one is AzurePrice.net. This is still in play. I'll show you that real quick. It gives you some options around VM comparisons, or if you want to kind of mix and match and look at the, how big the VMs are. I need this much RAM. What options do I have? And what's available in which region? Which regions are better priced? That's going to be that. this azprice.info was really cool. This let you import stuff from Excel, that thing that you can't do in Azure Pricing Calculator. It's currently down, maybe online in the future, so keep your eyes open. AzureCharts.com, and this one is down to it sounds like they lost their funding or lost their kind of account from Microsoft. They had a free account there. Might come at some point, but that one has some really cool, useful charts on there. So keep your eye out for that. That may come back online at some point. There's a big following there. But from the AzurePrice.net, basically this shows you different VMs here, and you can say, which region do you want, how many CPUs do you want to have here. I want to look at, I need to have at least, it's a little slow, it looks like. So like, I need to have at least like 4, I want to go up to 32, whatever, how much memory that I want to have, and it'll like just list out all the options for you, and then tell you where the best region is. You can compare by regions. There is an option to pay for a subscription. They'll give you a little bit more information, but alternative VMs, that type of thing, it's kind of you region pricing. Again, if you pay a little more, they'll tell you a little more per VM, but it'll tell you, at least on average, how much these VMs are costing from top to bottom. I'm not surprised that, oh wow, that's actually very low. US Gulf, Arizona. I expect that to be on the high end of the list here, right? But different countries where it's probably harder to get stuff built up, right? Like in Brazil, Switzerland, that's going to be a little bit more costly. So this gives you an idea of some ideas here of where costs are comparatively. And yeah, I think that's mainly it there. So hopefully this was really helpful. I might be looking at doing some more of these in the future to go a little bit deeper. So let us know if you have any questions or you want to see anything more. Go to info@coretech.com would be the best way to reach out to us kind of in general. If you want to ask me questions directly, not direction, but on LinkedIn, go ahead and hit me up there. Just only thing I ask is if you're not already connected, just send a note saying, hey, I saw your webinar or whatnot. So I know, oh yeah, cool. I'll accept your connection then. But yeah, feel free to ask me some questions there if you'd like to, or have anything else that you want to see, just let me know. Hopefully this was helpful, and happy estimating. All right, guys, have a good one.